In Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, in the August of 1885, they left a woman chained to the hitching post outside the Silver Spur for 2 days before anybody thought to call it a cruelty rather than a debt. The sun came down flat and white over the sagebrush flats that summer, the kind of heat that shimmered the air above the wagon ruts and drove the cattle into what shade the cottonwoods along Deer Creek could give, and the town of Rawlins smelled of hot dust and coal smoke and, closer to the saloon, of stale beer soaked into old boards. Garrett Pike rode in on the second morning for flour and a new latch for the smokehouse, and he saw her before he saw the sign. She sat in the dirt at the base of the post, with her wrists bound in a length of common trace chain, her wrap gone the color of the road, her hair come loose from its pins and stuck to her neck with the heat. A square of shingle hung around her neck on a cord, and someone had lettered it crudely in charcoal, "Owes a debt, $340. Nobody in that street was looking at her directly. That was the thing Garrett would remember longest, not the chain, but the particular, practiced way an entire town had learned not to see something in the middle of its own main road. He got down from his horse and walked to her. She looked up at him with eyes gone flat from 2 days in the sun, past fear now, into the kind of stillness a person goes to when there is nothing left to spend on hoping. She did not speak. He crouched down anyway, so his shadow fell across her, and that alone seemed to cost her something, the way sudden shade costs a body used to none. "How long you been out here?" he said. "Since Tuesday." Her voice had gone to gravel. "You needn't trouble yourself, mister. Dutch Selby'll be along directly to move me if I'm blocking custom. Ain't asking on Dutch Selby's account." Garrett Pike was 36 years old that August, a rancher with 340 acres along Deer Creek, 40 head of red Durham cattle, and a house he had built himself of hewn cottonwood log the summer his mother died and left him entirely alone in the world. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to any woman in Rawlins in the 3 years since, on account of nothing in particular except that there had never been a reason to. He stood and went into the Silver Spur. Dutch Selby ran the saloon and, more to the point, ran the paper on half the debts owed in that end of the county, and he was a heavy, soft-handed man who never once raised his voice because he had never once needed to. He looked up from his ledger with the mild, incurious pleasantness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Woman outside," Garrett said. "What's owed?" $340, plus what accrues for the keeping. Her husband Elias Calloway signed markers against me most of the spring before he took a fever in June and left her holding them. I offered her honest terms. She wouldn't sign the paper I put in front of her, so she sits till somebody settles it, or she comes to see reason. "What paper?" "Quitclaim on the Calloway homestead filing. 160 acres on the North Fork, good water on it. Seemed a fair trade against $340 of debt she can't otherwise pay." Selby's smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "You're welcome to buy the note yourself if it troubles you so." $340 cash, and she's yours to do with as you please. "She ain't going to be anybody's to do with as they please," Garrett said. "Not after today." He counted it out on the bar in gold and paper, the better part of his season's beef money, set aside for a new roof he would now be doing without, and Selby wrote the release without any particular hurry, and Garrett Pike walked back out into the white afternoon and knelt down and worked the chain loose from her wrists himself, since nobody had troubled to bring a key out with him. "Debt's paid," he said, "full and clear. I got a wagon and a ranch 11 miles north with a spare room in it, and you're welcome to either one or neither. Nobody's holding paper on you no more. Not him, not me." The woman looked at the raw chain marks on her own wrists, and then at him, and something in her face that had gone still for 2 days moved, just slightly, like water starting to run again after a hard freeze. "Ruth Calloway," she said. "That's my name, since you paid good money and might want to know it." Garrett Pike. He held out his hand to help her up, and she took it and stood on legs that had gone half to sleep from 2 days sitting in dirt. "Wagons this way, Mrs. Calloway. Ain't no hurry." She rode the 11 miles north in silence, sitting straight despite what it plainly cost her, and Garrett did not press her for talk, because he understood, without being told, that silence was the one thing left she could still choose for herself. The ranch lay in a bend of Deer Creek, with cottonwoods standing along the water and the Sierra Madre rising blue and serrated to the west, and the house was small and square and solid, log walls chinked with clay, a porch across the front, a barn better kept than the house, and a windmill that creaked on the turn like something talking low to itself. He carried in the little she had, one bundle, tied with the same cord that had held the shingle sign, which she had kept, wordlessly, and put in her lap for the whole ride, and set it inside the door. "There's a room at the back with a bar on the door that works," he said. "I'm in the bunkhouse from tonight. That's settled, and it ain't a thing you got to think on again." Then he went back out to see to the horses, and left her alone in a house with a locked door for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. Ruth Calloway did not sleep that first night, not from fear of the house, but from the strangeness of a silence that held no threat in it. She lay awake listening to the creek and the windmill, and, once, the low sound of a man moving quietly in a barn 100 yards off, banking a fire or checking a horse. And by the small hours she had worked out that the sound was not a danger circling closer. It was simply a man doing chores, because he could not sleep either. In the morning she was up before he was, and had the stove going, and had found, in the cold ash of the firebox, a stuck damper that she cleared with a bent nail before he ever came in from the barn. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the smell of coffee and the sound of the fire drawing properly for what was plainly the first time in a long while. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," said Ruth. "I wanted to." The weeks that followed had a shape to them the narrator will not pretend was eventful, because its quiet was the whole of its worth. She took the garden that had gone to weed since his mother died. She found the split shingle on the smokehouse roof that had been letting rain into the salt meat for 2 summers and fixed it herself, standing on a ladder in her one good dress because she owned no other clothes to work in, until Garrett came out and, without a word, handed up a pair of his own trousers cut down at the ankle, and went back to his own work as though it were nothing at all. He noticed things. He noticed she would not sit with her back to the door. He noticed she flinched at raised voices, but calmed at once around the horses, and that she had a way with the green colt he had been afraid to gentle, standing at the rail with her palm flat and her voice pitched low until the animal came to her of its own will inside a week. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked one evening, watching her run a hand down the colt's neck. "My father broke horses in Missouri. Watched him do it from the time I could walk." She did not look up. Elias never had the patience for it. Elias never had the patience for much, God rest him, though I've stopped asking God to. It was the first thing she had said about her husband that was not simply a fact laid down flat, and Garrett heard the crack in it and did not press further, and she was grateful for that more than she said. In the second week a storm blew down off the Sierra Madre in the middle of the night, sudden and violent the way high plains storms come, and Garrett was out in it getting the colt and the two mares under cover when a gust took the barn door out of his hand and swung it hard into his forearm, opening a gash he could not properly see to close by lantern light alone. Ruth came out into the rain without stopping for a wrap, and held the lantern steady with one hand while she worked the cloth tight around his arm with the other, close enough in that narrow stall that neither of them could have said afterward which one of them had stopped breathing first. The rain came down on the tin roof loud enough to cover most anything, and his face was a hand's breadth from hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved away. "You're bleeding on my good lantern," she said low, which was not at all what either of them was thinking about. "Ain't the lantern I'm worried on losing," Garrett said, and then seemed to hear himself say it, and looked away first, out at the rain, and the moment passed the way weather passes, sudden and complete, leaving the air changed behind it. She finished the binding without either of them saying anything further, and they went in out of the storm separately, by different doors, and neither one slept much the rest of that night for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. By the third week she had stopped sleeping with the chair under her door handle, though he never knew it, since he had promised himself he would not go past the porch after dark, and kept to it exactly. And the narrator will say plainly what neither of them said aloud that month. He noticed her, in the particular, helpless way a man notices a thing he has stopped expecting to want, and he had told himself for 3 years that wanting was a door he had nailed shut over his mother's grave, and both of those were true at once, and he carried them both out to the fence line every morning, and set them down, and had nothing to say about either. In the 4th week, a letter came up from Rawlins by a passing freighter, addressed to Ruth Calloway, care of the Pike Ranch, and it was from a land office clerk in Cheyenne, and it named a filing date, a survey number, and 160 acres on the North Fork of Deer Creek. Her husband's original homestead claim, still hers by law, proved up and patented in her name as his widow, worth considerably more than $340 to anyone who had troubled to check the county records before pricing her, like a debt. Ruth read it twice at the kitchen table, and then looked up at Garrett with an expression he could not entirely place. "Dutch Selby knew about this," she said slowly. "He had to have known. Nobody prices a chain and a sign at $340 against a woman worth 160 acres of good water unless he already means to take the land, not the debt." Garrett drove her into Rawlins the following Saturday to see the claim recorded proper at the land office, with Mrs. Farrow, the blacksmith's wife, riding along as chaperone at Ruth's own quiet insistence, since she had learned early what a town could make of a woman traveling alone with a man not yet her husband. They stopped for dinner at the hotel, at a table by the window, and it was there, over stewed chicken, and the first real conversation either of them had managed in a public room, that the town of Rawlins got its first good look at what was happening on the Pike place. "You've hardly said 10 words to me that weren't about chores or chickens," Ruth said, setting down her fork. "I've been 11 miles from you 3 weeks running, and I still don't know was your mother kind, or was your father, or did you always want cattle, or did it just happen to you the way most things happen to a man out here? My mother was kind. My father wasn't much of anything, one way or the other, gone before I was old enough to remember him plain. Cattle happened to me the way you said. Man needs a living, and this is the living that was here." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, the way he did when a thing cost him to say. "I built that house the summer she died because I couldn't stand the one we'd shared, every room of it full of her. Told myself I was building forward. Mostly I was just building somewhere to be quiet in. And now? Now it ain't so quiet, and I find I don't mind it near as much as I expected to." He looked at her steady. "In a public dining room, in front of Mrs. Farrow and half the window trade of Rawlins passing by outside." "You asked me a real question, Ruth Calloway. First one anybody's troubled to ask me in 3 years. I'd count it a kindness if you kept doing it." Mrs. Farrow, watching the two of them across her own plate, later told her husband it was the first time she'd seen Garrett Pike say more than a sentence together since his mother's funeral, and that whatever was growing out at that ranch, it had grown up honest, in daylight, in front of witnesses, which was more than most could say, before that letter finished settling into what it truly meant, and it would take the rest of that summer to settle all the way. There was one more quiet week on the Pike place, with the garden coming in, and the colt gentled, and a woman finally sleeping through a whole night. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything, and if you find yourself moved by tales of love that survived the worst the West could throw at them, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. Dutch Selby rode out to the Pike place himself on a Tuesday in early September, with 2 men behind him, and did not trouble to get down from his horse. Mrs. Calloway, he tipped his hat with the same soft, incurious pleasantness he had worn behind the bar. "I understand you've had word from the land office. I'll want that filing signed over. There's still the matter of the quitclaim I offered you before Mr. Pike here interrupted our business." "There is no matter," Ruth said. "The debt is paid. Mr. Selby's own paper says as much. The debt on your husband's markers is paid. The debt your husband owed me on a private wager the week before he died is a separate account, and it stands at $410, and I have his signature on it." Selby's smile did not move. I'd have thought a woman recently rescued from a hitching post might show a little more gratitude toward reasonable terms. Garrett came off the porch and stood at the rail. "You're on my land, Selby. State your business plain or ride off it." "My business is plain, Pike. I have paper on the Calloway man that predates his death, and I intend to collect it, one way or another, and the North Fork water is worth collecting against." He looked past Garrett to Ruth. "You'd do well to sign, Mrs. Calloway, before this account grows the way accounts do." "I won't sign anything of yours again," Ruth said, "not chained to a post, and not sitting at a supper table either. If you've a debt to prove it before the county judge in Rawlins, in the light, with witnesses, same as any honest man would." Selby's jaw tightened, just barely, the first crack Garrett had seen in that soft composure. "Then I expect I'll see you both in Rawlins," he said, and turned his horse, and the 2 men went with him, and the dust hung in the still air a long time after, the way it does when there is no wind at all. That evening Ruth sat on the porch step with a cup gone cold in her hands, and Garrett came up from the barn and sat at the far end, leaving 3 feet of board between them, same as he always did. "He'll forge the second marker," she said. "Elias never signed a wager with Selby that I know of, and I kept his books the last 2 years, badly as he ran them. There is no $410 owed. There's a man who wants water and land, and found a widow he figured had no one to stand behind her. He found the wrong widow, then, did he?" Ruth turned the cup in her hands. "I have been thinking on that, Garrett Pike. You paid a debt for a stranger chained to a post, and you have not once, in 4 weeks, asked me for a thing in return. Not the garden, not the horsework, not so much as a kind word required back. I keep waiting to learn what it costs, and it never comes due, and I do not know what to do with a man who won't collect. There ain't nothing to collect." I paid it because a town let a woman sit in the dirt for 2 days and called it business, and I couldn't ride past that and go on being a man I could stand to be." He looked out at the darkening fields. "My mother died in that house 3 years back. Took a fever same as your Elias, near enough. I sat with her 2 weeks, and there wasn't one soul in this county come to sit with me after. And I got so used to the quiet I told myself I preferred it. Then I hauled flour into Rawlins for a latch and found you in the dirt, and it turned out I didn't prefer it near as much as I'd told myself." Ruth set the cup down on the step between them. "I am not asking you to owe me anything either," she said. "I am telling you I am tired of being a debt in every account I have ever appeared in. My father's, when there was one less mouth wanted feeding. Elias's, when a marker needed covering. Selby's, when a claim needed collecting. I would like, once in my life, to be a person and not a figure on somebody's ledger." "You ain't a figure to me," Garrett said low. "Ain't been since I knelt down in that street." She crossed the 3 feet of board herself, and the narrator sets that down plainly, for there was not a thing in the world compelling her to do it. What passed between them then was brief, quiet, and entirely her own choosing. And what broke open in her was not desire, but the plain unbearable relief of being looked at by a man who had already paid every price he meant to ask of her, and asked nothing further. Selby's second move came 11 nights later, and it very nearly worked. He rode out past midnight with the same 2 men, not for a confrontation this time, but for the hay Garrett had put up along the creek bottom for winter feed. 4 stacks built square and tight over 3 weeks of August labor, and he fired all 4 before Garrett woke to the smell of it on the wind. Garrett was out in his nightshirt and boots with a wet blanket before the second stack caught fully, and he saved what he could of the near 2, and lost the far 2 entire, and in the scramble of it Selby's man put a rifle ball through the meat of his shoulder from the tree line, thinking the dark and the smoke and the confusion would cover it, and rode off believing the wound and the winter both would finish what the fire had started. Ruth found him on his knees in the mud at the edge of the creek, blood soaking dark through his shirt, and she did not scream and she did not freeze. She got her hands under his good arm and half carried, half dragged him the 80 yards to the house, and packed the wound with clean cloth and the last of the carbolic from the cabinet, and sat with him through what remained of that night while the fever came up, exactly as she had sat once, at her own kitchen table, doing sums for a dead man's debts, except this time the sitting was for a man who was going to live if she had anything to say about it. At first light she did not wait for a doctor to be sent for. She saddled the colt herself, the one she had gentled with a flat palm and a low voice, and rode the 11 miles to Rawlins alone, and went first to the county judge's own house before the man had finished his coffee, and laid before him what she had carried in the lining of her bundle since the day Garrett unlocked her chain, Elias's actual ledger, in her own careful hand, kept faithfully the 2 years she had managed what little money they had, showing every debt he had truly owed, and to whom, with no entry anywhere for $410 to Dutch Selby. He forged the second marker, she told the judge, standing in his front hall with mud on him and her husband's true accounts in her hands. And last night his men fired 4 stacks of another man's winter hay and shot him for good measure, and I expect if you send the sheriff out to the Silver Spur quick enough, you'll find the powder still on somebody's hands. The sheriff found more than powder. He found one of Selby's men in the back room of the saloon nursing a scorched sleeve from standing too close to his own fire. Willing enough to talk once he understood the judge already had the true ledger and a forged signature to compare it against. Dutch Selby was tried in Rawlins in the October term on the forgery and the arson both, and Ruth stood in that courtroom herself to give her evidence. in a clean dress and steady voice, laying her husband's true ledger open on the rail for the jury to see with their own eyes. "I kept these books 2 years while he lived," she told them, "because he had no head for figures, and I did, and I never once thought that keeping them honest would be the thing that saved my life. There is no entry here for $410 to Dutch Selby, and there never was, because my husband never owed it. Mr. Selby wanted water and land, and he priced a woman like a debt because he believed nobody would trouble to check the sum." It was the plain, patient evidence that undid every soft-spoken word Selby had ever said across that bar. The jury took less than an hour. He went to the territorial prison at Laramie for 11 years. The Callaway homestead patent stood exactly as the land office had recorded it, and no man in Carbon County troubled Ruth's claim to it again. Garrett Pike carried a stiff shoulder the rest of his days, and never once complained of it in her hearing, on the grounds, he said, that she would have only reminded him whose hay he had been fool enough to be standing near when he got it. He healed slow through that October, sitting more than a proud man liked on his own porch step, while Ruth ran the chores neither of them would have trusted a hired hand to do right, and it was in those slow weeks of mending, more than in any single dramatic hour, that both of them came to understand the shape of what they had built together. They married in November, at the little church in Rawlins, with the judge himself standing up as witness, and the whole business done plain and quick, because neither of them saw the sense in waiting on a thing they had already settled between themselves weeks before. Ruth kept the North Fork claim in her own name, and the 2 ranches ran as one from that winter on. Water shared generous between them the way it never had been, while Selby held paper over half the county. Winter came down hard that year, as it does in that country, and by the time the snow lay deep along Deer Creek, there was a length of common trace chain hanging on a nail beside the porch door of the Pike house, cleaned of rust, coiled loose, kept there not as a wound, but as a marker of the day everything had changed. Ruth had asked Garrett to save it the week after the wedding, and he had not asked her why, understanding well enough without being told. On a bright, cold morning the following spring, Garrett came up from the barn to find her on the porch, with a hammer and a scrap of iron, and watched her work 3 lengths of that old chain loose, and bend them, patient as anything, into a small crude bell, and hang it from the porch eave where the wind off the Sierra Madre would catch it. "Figured a thing that once held me down," she said, "ought to spend the rest of its days making a pleasant sound instead." It rang soft and low every evening after, through all the years that followed, and neighbors passing on the Rawlins Road came to know the Pike place by it before they ever saw the house itself. Their daughter was born the following autumn, and Ruth taught her, as soon as she was tall enough to reach, to run a hand flat down a green colt's neck and speak low until the animal came to her of its own will, the same as her mother had learned it from a man in Missouri who never lived to see any of what came after. Mrs. Farrow stood godmother, and liked to tell anyone who would listen that she had known it was coming since a dinner at the Rawlins Hotel over stewed chicken, when a rancher who had not strung 10 words together in 3 years suddenly could not seem to stop. Ruth kept Elias's old ledger, too, alongside the new one she and Garrett built together for the joined ranches, tucked at the back of a shelf, not from any tenderness toward the man himself, but because it had saved her life once. And a woman who has been priced like a debt does not throw away the proof that the accounting was wrong. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out on the sagebrush flats of Wyoming, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, The love between Garrett Pike and Ruth Calloway became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real. Though the whole of Carbon County remembered it anyway, every time that small iron bell rang out over Deer Creek. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.